So it's a little bit harder. However, it's got advantages. Excuse me, my throat is a little bit creaky. One of the advantages is when you go mushrooming, you don't have to be quiet, which is something you have to do when you go bird watching. You don't have to worry about standing underneath one and something dropping on you. None of that happens. And in addition, if you're lucky and if you're interested in that, you can find things which are edible. So mushrooming is something that is done on a wide scale. Uh, it's late in coming to North America. In Europe, it's been a long-standing occupation. In fact, if you ask some Frenchman or German or Polish or Russian, did you ever go mushroom hunting? He says, yeah, my grandmother took me mushroom hunting and she taught me which mushrooms are good to eat. The emphasis there is almost entirely on eating. Uh, for many of us, there is another interest, which is the actual challenge of identifying. As I say, it's a hard thing to do. It's demanding, and once you get there, you get a lot of satisfaction out of it because there's a lot to see and do. In your part of the country where it rains, you're going to find quite a bit of mushrooms. And I have to tell you that there is an Alabama Mushroom Society. I only know it from the internet, and it's remarkable. It's really quite a place. The website is, is found by Googling are quite really remarkable. It's an outstanding group. And if you are of a mind to follow up on mushrooming, I would strongly urge you to contact the Alabama Mycological Society. So we're going to go over a little bit of stories about mushrooms. We might as well start with the first slide. Could I have the first slide, Phil? So this is my introduction, and it shows you that mushrooms can be very beautiful. So the next slide. Could I have the next slide, please? Oopsie.
A slight technical glitch here. Let me make sure that I can. And we'll do this. How's that?
There we go. This gives you an idea of how much mushroom, how many mushrooms are cultivated. And you can see that over a period of about 30 some years, the world production of mushroom has gone up 30-fold, from 1 billion kilograms to 34 billion kilograms. And most of it took place in Asia, even though in this country, the cultivation of mushrooms has become significant. However, most of the mushrooms are cultivated in this country are white button mushrooms or Cremini or Portobellos. Why do I lump them together? Because those three are the same species, the different varieties and different degrees of cultivation. But the main mushroom that is grown worldwide in the Orient, in China and Japan and Korea, is Shiitake. I'm sure you know Shiitake because it's served in many restaurants. Oyster mushrooms, which are found nowadays, are found in regular supermarkets, are the next. And wood ears, which is a more a condiment than a real food, is used in Chinese food. Then enokis, which are little spaghetti-like, tiny, thin mushrooms, are also popular. So there's a lot of that. The next slide shows you what I mean when I say that uh, Portobellos and Creminis are the same mushroom. They are the same species called Agaricus bisporus. And the difference is really the variety that you cultivate and how long you let it go. If you let go a white button mushroom long enough, you end up with something that looks like a portobello. The taste is a little bit different. Now, what's dark about them, and it's important, is that they make spores. So the white button mushroom, when you cut through it, is pure white, or well, sort of pinkish white. Portobello, Cremini and Portobello are dark. The dark color is due to the spores. So now let's go into what are mushrooms. So the next slide shows you that first, what is a toadstool? That's a toadstool. The word toadstool has no technical meaning. You can, some people call toadstool a poisonous mushroom. Some people don't. It's up to you. There's no such thing as a scientific meaning to the word toadstool. But the next slide, wait a minute, I think we skipped a couple.
Well, let's see. We went from here to here to here.
Oh my, okay. It's not what I see here, but anyhow, there's a slide missing there. Oh, it's the next, fine. Okay, go back one. Morels are among the most edible mushrooms, and they are sought with great intensity. In fact, in the Midwest, the upper Midwest, in Michigan, Wisconsin, people go out looking for morels. They're spring mushrooms. Most mushrooms come out when it rains in the fall, late summer, fall. But these are spring mushrooms. And morels are so highly prized by people who know them that they are really uh, among the most, they're exquisitely tasting, and they have to really be high up in the list of mushrooming. I believe you find them in Alabama, all right. Anyhow, they're so prized that somebody wrote the following, Clary Hill. Next slide. He who secrets reveals and nothing conceals, somehow never tells, will grow morels. This was done by a guy in the late Rollo Leach from Boston. Let's go through a number of edible mushrooms first. Some of you know them, some of you don't. The next slide shows a chanterelle. Chanterelles are eaten in large amounts in Europe. They're found in, I'm sure they're found in Alabama. They're typical of the Northeast, Midwest, and Northwest. Alas, we don't find them in San Diego, and unless we're very lucky. Very rarely do we find them. But north of San Diego, if you go from about San Francisco, south of San Francisco, all the way to Alaska, you can really back up your car against a hillside and pack the trunk with chanterelles. They're delicious. I find them exquisite. The next slide shows oyster mushrooms. Oyster mushrooms grow on wood, but they can be cultivated rather easily. They're among the most easy mushrooms to cultivate. So we have oyster mushrooms galore in the stores. There are many varieties. Some are whitish like this one. Some are pink. Some are yellow. Some are bluish. They come in every variety. They taste about the same. They're not the strongest taste in gastronomy, but they're pretty good. The next slide shows poisonous mushrooms. This is an Amanita. Amanita, by the way, mushrooms have a genus name like Amanita and a species name, in this case, Ocreata. These are so-called destroying angels, of which there are many varieties, and I'm sure they're common in your area, and you want to be careful because you eat them and you can get very sick. Oddly, a word about the intoxication by amanitas. Oddly, you don't get sick right away. In fact, you may get a little bit queasy, but then you get better and say, hey, I did okay. I ate a mushroom and I'll be okay. The next day, your liver goes to pieces and you can die from damage to liver and kidneys. In fact, some people need a liver transplant. So it's a dangerous game to do. You don't want to do it. You don't get sick just by looking at it or by touching it. You really need to eat a good, sort of a fair size specimen. But still, you don't want to do that. So this illustrates a law that you have to obey. Namely, if you ever find a mushroom and you think you've identified it, don't eat it. That's not good enough. You have to have some confirmation, and the best confirmation you can have is from a member of the mushroom club. So that's a reason for joining the mushroom club, because if you find a mushroom you think you've identified, you've been doing this for a while, let's say, you've got used to it. Excuse me, can I have a glass of water? Um, you're comfortable that you've identified it, don't eat it. That's not sufficient. You really need confirmation by somebody who knows what they're talking about. And that's one of the best reasons for joining the mushroom club. The next slide, please, is my favorite mushroom, which is Porcini mushroom. It's called King Boletes on the West Coast, or Cep in French. It's known as Boletos edulis. These are nice, robust mushrooms, and they're delicious. They're not only delicious fresh, they're even better when you dry them. When you cut them in little pieces and dry them, you find that, thank you, you find that they are really among the best taste there is in the kitchen. So if you can't find porcini by yourself, in specialty stores you can find powders of porcini. They're fine. Oddly enough, you can really do well with that. The next slide shows you another of the common mushrooms. Perhaps the paradigm of a mushroom is a red cap with white dots. If you ask a kid to draw a mushroom, they'll draw you this. Anyhow, it's called Amanita Muscaria. Muscaria, Amanita is the same genus as the deadly mushroom. This one isn't deadly poisonous, but it is quite poisonous. In fact, it's also hallucinogenic. So I like to say that the trip when you're on this mushroom is to the emergency room. Anyhow, Amanita muscaria. Muscaria means of the fly, and it's known as the fly agaric, and in every language it has that name. Fliegenpilz in German, Amanita Mush, which means fly killer. In Danish, it's red fly mushroom. Even in Japanese, it's called red fly catcher. So what's the story? Why flies? And the reason that I say it's hallucinogenic, and if you mix the pieces of the mushroom with, say, milk, and you leave them out, flies will be attracted. And since it's hallucinogenic, they go spinning, they go on a trip, and they can be swatted. So it's not that they kill the mushroom, but they make the mushroom, the fly, it makes the flies swattable. So there we go. The next slide, please.
Elio, let me pause just for a second. I want to make sure that I'm not losing anybody here. Hold on just 1 second.
Sure.
And I want to see whether or not I can share the screen again. And what I'd like to do is to be able to do it like this. And it will not let me go from one slide to the next. So I have to go back. And so I'm going to stop. And I'm going to go back here. And I'm going to do this again. And I'll just continue. Here we go.
All right. So now the popularity of the fly agaric is seen that it's usually seen in a lot of tchotchkes, mushroom tchotchkes. The elf is in the middle is sitting on an Amanita muscaria. The lady on the right is sitting on Amanita muscaria, and so is the guy on the left. So if you ask people what is the paradigm of a mushroom, they're likely to come up with fly agaric. As I say, it is poisonous. Some people trip on it. Not a good idea. Next slide, please. And this is from the Alabama Mushroom Society. These are mushrooms that grow on wood. Many mushrooms grow exclusively on wood. And this is a somewhat unusual one. And it's part of, as I say, consider looking into membership in the Alabama Mushroom Society. It is a remarkable place. Next slide, please. Now, mushrooms are fungi. So what are fungi? Fungi, let me say something about them because there is something separate. They are a separate kingdom. They're not animals, they're not plants. You think they're more like plants because they don't move. Plants don't much move, but they're not. They're a separate group, a separate kingdom, the Mycota. And it's worth knowing about them because they're nearly ubiquitous. They're found in environments which are dry, which are wet, hot and cold, in the ocean, in regular waters. They're all over the place. And in the air, you find the spores of mushrooms in large numbers. So we breathe in mushroom spores or fungus spores all the time. Mushroom and fungi are not synonymous. The word fungi is more inclusive. It includes yeast, it includes molds, things we don't usually call mushrooms. The main thing that fungi do for us is they are the great recyclers. They degrade uh, plants, trees, and they are essential for the recycling of matter. If it weren't for fungi, the woods in the forest would not degrade very much. They degrade some because of insects, but not much. So if you lived in a world without fungi and you wanted to go for a walk in the woods, you need a hacksaw to make your way. Anyhow, they do things for us and against us. They make drugs like antibiotics and statins. Penicillin is made by a mold called penicillin. Statins are made mainly by fungi. They carry out alcoholic fermentations of wine and beer. They're involved in making bread because bread rises due to yeast, which are fungi, and they cause some diseases. The diseases they cause range from the fairly minor, like athlete's foot, which can be painful and bothersome, but is usually not life-threatening, to some which are more more of a problem, like yeast infections, especially in females, to the very severe, like valley fever, which is a disease in the Central Valley of California and in Arizona and New Mexico, which is caused by a fungus. And there, in your part of the world, you have a disease called histoplasmosis. And histoplasmosis is also caused by a fungus. So they do a lot of things. We live in association with fungi. Fungi are our neighbors. We deal with them all the time. We breathe in fungal spores, and some of us are allergic to that. So they can cause allergies as well. So it's fungi are hard to neglect, hard to forget about. You really should know something about fungi just to survive in our environment. The next slide, please. And these are molds, of course. Molds are fungi. And let's see what they're made of. The next slide shows you that if you tease out some of the white stuff and put it under the microscope, this is an electron microscope. This is what you find. You find a series of filaments which are connected with each other. And this meshwork is called a mycelium. So there are two words you need to learn. Mycelium is the meshwork, and it's made up of filaments, and the filaments are called hyphae. Singular is Haifa, like a port in Israel, and Haifa is plural. So mycelium is the meshwork, hyphae are the filaments. The next slide, please. If you look underneath a mushroom, you will find one or two varieties. One is tubes, which is what you find in porcini. These are very fine, fine tubes. Excuse me. They can be, excuse me. They can be bigger than that. Or the next slide, you find what are called gills. If you turn a portobello around, this is probably a portobello, you find these partitions, these lamellae, these lines. What's all that about? Both the pores and the gills are a way to make bigger the surface. And why do we want to make the surface bigger? Because on this surface, underneath the caps of mushrooms, is where spores are made. And spores are like seeds that are wait for the organism to spread itself all over the neighborhood. Spores are single cell entities. Next slide. And this is what they look like. This is sort of a fanciful representation of a gill cut through, and what you find on the right is the tissue of the gill, and what you find on the left is protruding from the surface of the gill are these roundish um, structures called spores. Now, a spore, if it falls in the right place, will develop into a mycelium, and a mycelium may develop into a mushroom. So a spore is a way of making more mushrooms, or if you wish, a spore is a way of making more spores. However, notice that if the spores remained attached like that, they wouldn't travel very far. They would all fall when the mushroom decomposes. They would all fall in the same place and stay put. Not much is gained from that. So what happens is the spores are actually ejected from the surface of the gills of the tubes. Okay, and this is how it works. The next slide. Somebody took a picture at a ultra high speed uh, photography, 100,000 frames a second. Not bad. And what you see is on the bottom, have a look. You see that there is a round object sticking on a little pedicle, and when you follow the slice, it it is detached and it flies away. Why does it fly away? On the top, you can see that it forms a little bubble. It's called Buller's bubble. And the bubble gets big enough, it collapses, and by the negative effect of that collapse, the spore is ejected, and it's ejected at initial speeds of 5 feet per second. Now, it doesn't travel all of 5 feet, it travels a little bit of that, but the initial speed is amazingly fast. The acceleration is 10 times the force of gravity. So off they go, and the next slide shows you they don't travel forever because they run into the barrier of the viscosity of air. So when they go a certain distance, they lose that velocity and they drop vertically. So when they drop, all this is happening underneath a cap. What happens is that in the forest there are winds along the surface, and you can't feel them, but they are there. And these winds carry the spores aloft because the spores are very small, they're very light. So this is the trajectory of a spore, and it's what I think a pitcher would dream of. Next slide. This is what any baseball pitcher would dream of: a ball that travels totally horizontally and then suddenly drops down. Okay, the next slide shows you that you can, it's important to know when you identify mushrooms, what color the spores are, because spores come in different colors. These are blackish, they can be grayish, pink, white, cream color, in very rare cases, greenish. So knowing what color the spores are tells you what group of mushrooms they belong to. It's the first step in identification. So how can you tell what color spores you have? Well, if you take a cap and you put it right side up on a piece of paper and you wait a while, this is what you get. You get spore prints because the spores will fall out. The spores will continue to be ejected by the mechanism I showed you, and they will drop down and deposit it on paper. So obviously, if you think you have dark spores, you use white papers. If you have very light spores, you don't want to use a light paper because you can't see them. Use a dark paper. Often you can use half and half, one piece of white, one piece of dark. You put the mushroom on top, you'll find what color spores they are. So no spore prints are something you may have done as kids. Teachers like to do that. And it's something that's necessary in order to identify what species you have. The next slide, please. So what, I don't know what click to add the title is doing there, but anyhow, what kind of mushrooms are they besides edible and poisonous? The next slide shows you that there are a lot of varieties. These are puffballs. Puffballs are something that doesn't look like a mushroom. They look like a ball. In fact, they're found on, if you find them on golf courses, you may think they're golf balls. They are, they spread the spores by a different mechanism. They don't have gills, they don't have pores, they're sacs. In the sacs of spores. And what happens is that if they develop a hole in the middle, like you find on the left top, and if you squeeze them, this is what happens. Next slide. They puff away. So what happens is this, uh, does this in nature, does this happen only when there's a friendly mycologist who comes and squeezes a puffball? Well, not quite. What happens is that a raindrop falling on the surface of a puffball will depress the surface. The surface, the skin is fairly elastic, so it depresses the surface. When it does that, out comes a puff of spores. The next slide shows you that puffballs can be gigantic. They can be bigger than that. In fact, some people driving by a field with full of puffballs think they're looking at sheep. They're so big. Anyhow, some are small, some are very big. They come in all sizes. The next slide shows you the uses for puffballs. So they're good to eat, by the way. They're not fantastic. Of course, when you find a giant puffballs, you have enough to eat for a long time. They're okay. Uh, Let me say something about edibility. Mushrooms, in my book, in anybody's book, range in edibility from fabulous, like porcini mushroom, chanterelles, to okay, like puffballs. Puffballs are fairly, I wouldn't say tasteless, but they don't have a very strong taste. They're worth eating. Next slide, please. Just to show you a puffball, which is, mushrooms can be very beautiful. I make a point of that in my book, that these are the flowers of the forest. And this is an example of an absolutely gorgeous mushroom. It's found in the Sierras of the Western United States. It's absolutely spectacular puffball. It's a puffball with uh, little cones sticking out, Calvacia sculpta. The next slide, please. And then there is the stinkhorns. Stinkhorns are called stinkhorns because they smell to high heaven. If you are in the vicinity of a stinkhorn, you think there's a carrion there. And this one has an interesting name, phallus, because it looks like one, impudicus, which means shameless. It's a shameless phallus. So what goes on here? Where are the spores made? The spores are made on that greenish surface on the top, and it's slimy. So the spores don't fly away like you expect them. However, the reason for the smell is that it attracts insects. Insects think the smell is just fine. They're attracted to carrion. And so they land on the surface. The spores get entangled in the legs. The insects fly away and they spread the spores. The next slide shows you a cartoon. You may want to look at it and see why it's funny. Anyhow, okay, we'll go to the next one. Many fungi grow as brackets. Shiitake is one of them, by the way. It used to be that shiitake was cultivated on logs. It is now cultivated on bags of sawdust, which is cheaper to make. But anyhow, the bracket fungi which stick out from wood. The next slide shows that some are edible. This is found all over the United States. It's called the chicken of the woods. The Latin name, you have it there, Letiporus sulphureus. It's called sulphureus because the underneath is sulfur color in one species. It's a good mushroom. It's quite edible. Some people get slightly sick, and that, by the way, is a cautionary tale. Although some mushrooms are totally edible for most people, There are some people who are sensitive to them. That's true for any food. So this is why when you try eating a mushroom, you want to eat a very small amount first. Leave the rest in the refrigerator for the next day. Anyhow, this is a good mushroom. It's really quite worth knowing because you can find this and other kinds of bracket fungi which are edible. When you find them, you can find 10 pounds worth of it. It's really quite large. Next slide, please. And there are some mushrooms which look like corals. This is on the right is a rare coral, on the left is a coral mushroom. And the coral mushrooms are not found on the sea, they're found in the forest. They look a lot like corals. The next slide tells you why this is confusing.
Oops. Which one? Here?
This one.
Okay.
So this guy sitting on a psychiatrist's couch says, how am I supposed to relax in a world where truffle can mean either chocolate or fungus? Anyhow, truffles are mushrooms, are fungi. They're underground, they live underground. How do they spread the spores? Well, obviously not by popping the spores out because it's all underground. They do it by making a smell, just like the stinkhorns. They make a smell which attracts small animals. The animals eat the truffle. The spores are passed intact through the GI system and they're spread throughout. The next slide. This is another subject that I like to talk about. Namely, I have a hobby within a hobby. My main hobby is mushrooming, but within that hobby, I have a study of works of art which have mushroom pictures on them. And with a bunch of other people, we have a registry of mushrooms in works of art. It's sponsored by the North American Mycological Association, which is the blanket society to which many mushroom clubs belong. What we do is we collect pictures of pictures that contain mushrooms. We do this only for Western art. The reason is I don't speak Chinese or Japanese. It would be very difficult for us to do this for the very rich holdings which exist in Oriental pictures. They are really quite rich in especially Chinese, but we don't have those. We only have European and North American. And so we collect pictures, and we have pictures which show mushrooms in various forms and shapes. They tell us something about what mushrooms were prized and what mushrooms were considered to be important enough to paint. The next slide shows you one of the oldest ones. This is a fresco in Herculaneum, which is the place near Pompeii, which got buried when Vesuvius popped in the 1st century BC. And on top, you have a brace of quail, and underneath we have a mushroom which is totally recognizable. I'll give you the Latin name, Lactarius Deliciosos. It's delicious, and it's eaten now in the Mediterranean. We find it in North America, but it's not that common. Anyhow, it's a mushroom that is prized in many parts of the world, and it's called Deliciosos because it's really quite good. So that's one of the oldest items we have in our registry. The next slide shows you that the Romans really went in for mushrooms. These are clearly porcini mushrooms. You can really tell them what they are. They're from a mosaic. I wrote to the Vatican Museum to ask for more information about it. I never heard. Anyhow, I have to go to Rome to find out more about this mosaic. There are a number of other mosaics showing mushrooms from Roman times. Next slide. In this continent, we find that the Mexicans were big on mushrooms, probably going back to about the 1st century Common Era. This is a picture from a codex. A codex was what the Spanish priests, when they arrived to North America, commissioned locals to depict local habits and forms. So it shows a devil touching a native who's eating mushrooms, And on the left, you find a nice representation of mushrooms. Now, why did they eat them? Well, they ate them because obviously they were good to eat, but also because they had divinatory powers. That there's some of the hallucinogenic mushrooms that are found in Mexico, especially magic mushrooms, can give you a high with a buzz. The next slide. And this is a scene, going back to Europe, a scene from a painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder, about 15, he lived between 1528 and 1569. It's called A Visit to the Farmhouse. Now, the way people ate dinners, the food, they did not sit down at the table to eat lunches and dinners. They simply had a cauldron with food cooking all day long. And when they were hungry, they went and helped themselves. And I don't know if you can tell it from this magnification, but in that cauldron, you can see mushrooms bouncing around. So this is the fact that mushrooms were eaten in the Renaissance. The next slide, please. And in the Baroque style, in the Baroque times, there are a lot of mushrooms. On the lower right, you find a collection of things which are mushrooms. Those are called Caesar's mushrooms, and they are called the Amanita Caesaria. But when you heard Amanita before, in context of very poisonous mushrooms, these are not so poisonous, but they are, in fact, they're very edible. They're eaten today. The next slide. So one of my favorite, which is a mushroom seller, and she looks busy with Caesar mushrooms, moving him from one place to another. So we have a rich offering of, but you can go to the internet and Google mushrooms in works of art or registry of mushrooms in works of art, and you find it. The next slide shows you another kind of mushroom art. Okay, and with that, in the next slide, I thank you for your attention. It was a lot of fun. I'm ready to answer questions now. Thank you.
All right. Let me. Okay. Thank you, Elio. I actually have a couple of questions, but I know that we will turn this over to everybody else. One question I have has to do with, and we mentioned this before you started actually talking, was about truffles. And what is it that makes truffles so valuable and that are so desirable that as I was reading just recently in a newspaper article about how people that hunt for truffles are pretty fierce in their guarding of areas where they have these truffles growing and all that. Could you tell us a little more about truffle hunting or anything to do?
Well, truffles, if you never eaten a truffle, you're in for this very interesting, different experience. They have a taste which is quite unique, and it's, to most people, it's delicious. My wife doesn't really care for them so much, but I do. I think they're really fantastically delicious. Now, they grow underground and they emit an odor which is detected by pigs. Now, pigs, unfortunately, think that this is a sex attractant, and so they go after it. So if you take a pig to the woods and it finds a truffle, you better fight the pig, because the pig is one that wants to eat the truffle. In addition, lugging a pig through the woods is not very handy. So dogs come in. Dogs are not particularly attracted to truffles. However, they can be taught. That is, you can teach a dog a lot of things. You can teach him to recognize truffles. And when they recognize truffles, they will go to the truffle. They will not eat it. And you can just simply excavate the area and find the truffle there. So they're hard to get. That's one reason why they're relatively rare. They are found in parts of Italy, parts of France, and they're found in the Pacific Northwest. There are Oregon truffles, which are delicious and which are quite abundant, actually. But then they don't make it to the market, but they're really there. Anyhow, so truffles are delicious and rare. So they can sell for extravagant prices, hundreds of dollars per pound or more. So that's the story on truffles.
Elio, here in the fall, sometimes when we get a lot of rain, you'll see and I think you called them puffballs, the white ones.
Yeah.
But they form a kind of a semicircle in the lawn. Why do they do that?
Yes, these are called fairy rings, because we used to thought that fairies make them. So why do mushrooms make a fairy ring? A fairy ring is a circle, and the circle, by the way, can be hundreds of feet wide. Okay, not usually, but it can be. What happens is a mushroom will grow in a certain place, and it can only grow outward, so it expands. Now, it will not make, so it becomes a circle of mycelium, or these filaments, okay, underground. However, it will not make a mushroom where it's been before. So it can only make a mushroom at the edge, and the edge is forever expanding. So this is how you make a fairy ring. It is not due to fairies dancing inside of it.
Elio, a question for you about the mycelia, which spread very, very widely over long distances. I know that mushrooms are responsible for taking care of or dead things in the forest. But do these mycelia serve in any way in the communication between trees, or providing any type of interaction with other forest things?
I'm glad you asked the question. Mycelia are very important in nature because they connect with the roots of trees. It's called a mycorrhizal relationship. You may have heard the word mycorrhiza. Myco is fungus, rhiza is root. So they connect to the roots of trees, and they transport nutrients and water to the tree. The mycelium becomes a drinking straw for the plant. That's part of what they do. And they do it over a huge area. The areas can be the size of a county, maybe bigger. But in addition to doing that, they also communicate between trees. So the trees can supply signals, chemical signals from one tree to another. And so they're terribly important in the well-being of forests. There's a lot to this.
No, it's like a root extension in a way.
Sorry? Okay.
All right.
If you went to the store and bought a portobello mushroom and brought it home and put it on paper, how long would it take to make one of those prints?
How long will it take one?
To make one of the prints of the
spore
print.
Oh, it depends on how fresh the mushroom is. A very fresh mushroom will take about an hour, 2 hours, something like that. If it's a little bit less fresh, it will not make so many spores. You better wait a while. And you might as well cover it with a glass container or something so that it doesn't dry out. So that's how you make a spore print. I'm not sure about portobellos are probably a good one to try. I imagine a fresh portobello will make a spore print in a short time, about an hour maybe.
The puffballs, I guess they're puffballs that I've seen, but in my yard or other places, they're around here. When I see them, they're dark. They're almost dark brown or black, and if you kick them, that's the color of what comes out is a darker color, maybe as light as rust. But is that the same thing?
I may have given you the wrong impression that puffballs are all white. They're not. They're puffballs which on the inside make black spores. And so they come in all kinds of shapes and forms. The dark spored puffballs may be poisonous. So one rule about eating puffballs is they have to be pure white. The spores become dark even in the white spored mushrooms. So don't eat any puffball that's not pure white. It should look like cottage cheese, like pressed cottage cheese. But they're relatively safe if you follow that rule and stay away from puffballs which have colors. You're gonna be okay.
Neat.
You guys ask good questions.
Are there any other questions? We have a little time here. Well, certainly I've enjoyed this. I'm, you know, other than the commercial cultivation of mushrooms, and I can remember back in grocery stores some years ago, they had no mushrooms, and now, of course, you can buy a wider variety. I assume that in markets in Europe and other places in Asia, you can find a much wider variety of mushrooms than
That's
you
true.
can here, right?
That's true, but it's not bad now. I mean, in most places, the fancier supermarkets will carry 5, 6 different kinds of mushrooms.
I see.
They're all cultivated, by the way. Wild mushroom picking is done commercially in the northwestern United States on a large scale. So you can find, say, mushrooms like chanterelles or porcini cannot be cultivated very well. Morels can, but it doesn't work. It doesn't pay. So wild mushrooms are, by and large, picked from the wild, and that's done on a scale large enough that can be available commercially. But most of the mushrooms that you find in the store are cultivated, like the varieties of oyster mushrooms. They're easy to cultivate, and so that's how it's done.
I see.
I think Lynn has a question, Phil.
Yes, they sell mushroom soil where I used to live, and supposedly it is the leftover. So you're not allowed to grow but one batch of mushrooms in this soil, which is sterilized cow manure. And then after that, it's still sterilized, but you're not. Is that the way they grow the mushrooms, with this sterilized manure, and then can't do it but once?
I'm not sure I got the point. Could you repeat the question, please?
Oh, what is the soil that these cultivated mushrooms grow in? I have heard that it's cow manure that has been sterilized.
Oh, okay. Well,
Because
the story is
where I
that
lived before, they sell this.
yeah, the way
Is that correct?
the button mushroom, the white button mushroom is cultivated, used to be on horse manure. Okay, and the horse manure is sterilized by letting it ripen. When it ripens, it gets very hot and it kills all the bacteria in it, and it's very safe. I mean, it may not be appealing aesthetically, but you find no trace of the bacteria from the manure in the fungus. So that's the way they used to be made. Now I think they use other ways. I'm not sure I know what the substrate is that they use now.
All right.
Thank you.
Keith, do you have a question?
I can ask if he has any tips for cooking mushrooms. I find if I fry them and bring out the flavor quite a bit.
Keith, we can't hear you real well. That was a little distorted. Is there anyone else that has a question? Well, if that's it, thank you very much, Elio, and we'll look forward to seeing as many of you as possible tomorrow for our speaker on Ben Beard. And until then, everybody have a good day.
Bye,
Thank you
everyone.
very much.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Bye.
Yes.
Join us
Thank
some
you very much. I appreciate your attention and your interest. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it greatly.
Thank you for
Bye,
being
Kathy. Bye,
Bye.
Stephen.
Bye.
Stay